Hello and welcome back to Reality Check. I'm Ross Coulthart, and today we're delving into the mystery of 9/11. Now, I was a reporter covering the tragedy, the attack on the incredible attacks on America in 2001. And it's a shock to me today, as it was back then, the way in which this incredibly well planned attack happened under the radar of the most powerful country in the world and the most well informed intelligence agencies working for that country. It was an appalling intelligence failure, catastrophic intelligence failure. And the thing that leapt out to me as a reporter in the days following the attacks was, why were so many Saudis, including Saudis who were linked to the House of Saud, families with close connections to the royal family in Saudi Arabia, why were they, when there was a no-fly zone over the United States, allowed to discreetly leave the United States, including, incredibly, as we discovered in the days following, about 24 members of the bin Laden family, no less. And I spoke at the time to an FBI investigator who told me that he, for the life of him, couldn't understand why, if these people were being allowed to leave America, why weren't statements being taken off them? What was the explanation for that? And a lot of those questions remain unanswered. And of course, 3,000 plus people died in that tragedy. And our guest today is one of those people who lost loved ones. Terry Strada, you represent an organisation that is taking a lawsuit against the Saudi government, and I think also members of the bin Laden family. Maybe if you could just please introduce yourself to Reality Check. And I want to explore with you today what's going on behind the scenes, the mysteries, the questions that are still unanswered about 9/11.
Yes, thank you very much for having me today. My name is Terry Strada, and I am the National Chair for the 9/11 Families United. This organization consists of over 10,000 victims' family members, injured survivors, and those who are sick and dying from their exposure to the toxic fumes at Ground Zero. We are suing the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for the role that it played in aiding and abetting the 19 hijackers that came here and murdered our loved ones.
So that's a big call. Obviously, I don't doubt for a moment that bin Laden and his family, I know that members of the bin Laden family were funding, perhaps inadvertently, let's give them that excuse, through the Al Haramain charity. I know that money was going from very wealthy people in Saudi Arabia, including members of the bin Laden family, to directly to some of the 9/11 hijackers. But
Yes.
in the 9/11 Commission report, there was very much a spin that came through that report that such connections, such charitable payments were inadvertent, that they weren't intended. And there was the idea pushed by the 9/11 report. I mean, this is the definitive investigation into the 9/11 investigation. We were told that, quote, it does not appear that any government other than the Taliban financially supported al-Qaeda before 9/11, although some governments may have contained al-Qaeda sympathizers who turned a blind eye to al-Qaeda's fundraising activity. And it went on to say Saudi Arabia has long been considered the primary source of al-Qaeda funding, but we have found no evidence that the Saudi government as an institution or senior Saudi officials individually funded the organization. And they said in brackets, this conclusion does not exclude the likelihood that charities with significant Saudi government sponsorship diverted funds to al-Qaeda. Now, Terry, that's the definitive finding from the 9/11 Commission, which was obviously quite a few years ago. What do we know now?
We know so much more now than we did when the 9/11 Commission was published. The FBI withheld a lot of evidence that they were mandated to hand over to the 9/11 Commission. They withheld it from them. They've withheld it from the 9/11 family's lawsuit. But we have been able to uncover quite a lot of new evidence. But if you don't mind, I'd like to put the lawsuit into perspective, and that you have to go back to the 1990s leading up to 2001 and remember that the kingdom was exporting extremism all around the world. They were sending their religious clerics and operatives into their mosques, and they were spreading the virulent Wahhabi form of Islam. The United States was not immune to this activity. Mohammed bin Salman himself, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, he acknowledges that his government partook in this type of activity. And now we know from US intelligence reports that some of these operatives, and they were working out of the Saudi Arabian embassy in Washington, D.C., they were working in a program called the Ministry of Islamic Affairs, MOIA. And some of these individuals we now know were directly assisting the 9/11 hijackers. When
But
we took
what?
this to court, I'll just finish and you can use it however you want. But when we took this evidence and laid it out in front of a judge, put it out on the table, and we had FBI reports, affidavits, U.S. investigative reports, and we laid it all out, and we challenged the kingdom to prove that these individuals were not Saudi government officials. The Saudi Arabian government was unwilling to do that and unable to do that. And that is why the judge ruled that our lawsuit could move forward.
Because previously there was a sovereign immunity, you couldn't sue a government. And what's the law that was passed in the Congress that allowed this lawsuit to happen? Can you explain that to our audience?
Yes, the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act, it's called JASTM, that's the acronym for it. And that is a law that was enacted in 2016. It took 7 years to enact this piece of legislation that allows U.S. citizens that are harmed by a designated terrorist organization that commits a terrorist attack on U.S. soil, that we can hold the sponsors of that attack responsible in a court of law, in a U.S. court in civil litigation. And the purpose for that is fulsome liability, to enable the victims' families, the injured survivors, to have some type of accountability. And that lawsuit, or that, I'm sorry, that law, what enabled us to continue our lawsuit in the courtrooms, because yes, they were being granted sovereign immunity, which nobody is entitled to if they're involved in a terrorist attack.
So, Terry, before we go any further, I'm going to ask you about what happened to your loved one. Let's talk about your own personal experience with 9/11 very briefly.
Okay. Yeah, so I lost my husband, Tom. He was 41 years old. He worked for Counter Fitzgerald. He was on the 104th floor of the North Tower. On that Tuesday morning, he got up to go to work, and I stayed home with our 3 children. Tommy was 7, Caitlin was 4, and the baby was 4 days old, Justin. Tom was only going to go to work for half a day and come back early because we had the newborn in the house. Shortly after the first plane hit the North Tower, my phone rang and Tom was on the other end. And it was horrible. He was frantically telling me what was happening, and I could hear the screams and the fear. We had over 25 friends that he worked with on his desk, every single person, because nobody made it out of Canada that day. So with that phone call, I call it a blessing and a curse. It was a blessing for him to reach me, but it's been a curse I've had to live with, hearing that and being, kind of brought right into the horror of all of it.
And you've dedicated pretty much your entire life since to getting to the truth of why that attack was allowed to happen.
Yes, I have. I started in 2002 when I stood on a stage in Washington, D.C. with some of the bravest 9/11 families I know, and we announced our lawsuit. Back then, my organization was called 9/11 Families United to Bankrupt Terrorism. And the mission hasn't changed. We've wanted to expose the underbelly of terrorism, the financiers, and we believe if we can hold them accountable and punish them, that we can stem the flow of money that supports these terrorist organizations. And I believe if the US government, my own government, had taken a stronger stance on terrorism financing after 9/11, we might not see the growth of Boko Haram, Hamas, Hezbollah. We wouldn't have empowered other countries. You can finance terrorism because even the United States doesn't hold you accountable. But the
So,
families.
Terry, I had my own personal experience with Wahhabist Islam, funded by the Saudi Arabians. I covered the Bali bombing attack, and I saw things I never ever want to see again: burned bodies and people who subsequently died who were suffering terrible burns in hospital in Bali. I was sent over there by my Australian network in the very early days. And then we went to Solo in Java, where we confronted Abu Bakr Bashir, who was the Jama'ah Islamiyah boss of the Jama'ah Islamiyah terror group. And the thing that shocked me was how a lot of the people involved in the Bali bombing were middle class kids whose Jakarta based parents had looked for a cheap private school education offered by the Wahhabist madrasas funded by the Saudi government across Indonesia. And
Yes.
what shocked me was that there were people from your country's CIA in the American embassy who were telling me how this was the real cancer that was radicalizing young youth right across Southeast Asia. And one of the problems that we have in Australia, we have beautiful Muslim communities, but there are a fringe of extremist young people and elderly Wahhabist clerics who have a malign influence
Mhm.
on the people in these communities because of
Mhm.
essentially a strand of Islam,
Yes.
extremist, zealous strand of Islam that was funded directly by the Saudi government as a
Yes.
way of propping up Saudi influence. And you're saying that this is very much the same kind of cancer that's behind what you've uncovered in your investigations.
Yes, absolutely. It is the kingdom spreading of extremism around the world. That was their second export to oil in the 90s. They don't deny it. Our government acknowledges it, and so does MBS. That
Okay,
that
but can I come then to the quick?
Mhm.
Um, I want to take you through the evidence that we know about at the moment in the
Mhm.
lawsuit, because I think one of the difficulties you have as a campaigner is that you're probably aware of some of the redacted material that at the moment is not public information.
Right.
But, and I'm a little bit aware of some of that material that points to more alleged complicity of senior Saudi government
Mhm.
officials.
Mhm.
The question in my mind is, yes, you had a lot of extremist Wahhabist supporters inside the Ministry of Islamic Affairs in Saudi Arabia. And the line that was pushed by the 9/11 report was that because the Saudi royal family, the House of Saud, they don't really govern. They
Mhm.
let the governing be done for them. They were unwittingly exploited by these extremist Wahhabists inside the government, that they weren't aware of these people doing these terrible things, funding through known charities these terror groups. Let's go through the evidence that you have at the moment for your lawsuit that's public, including the video that came out most recently. And then let's talk about what might be behind the redacted material that you're still pushing to get put out into the public domain.
Right. So 10 days after September 11th, the Metropolitan Police in London raided Omar al-Bayoumi apartment. And he was, at that time, a person of interest because his name was on the lease for the two hijackers that crashed into the Pentagon, Hazmi and Madar, the first arriving hijackers. When they seized this evidence out of his apartment, it was a treasure trove of evidence. And they sent it to the FBI. It contained videos, it contained his phone book, it contained a drawing, a plane trajectory, which we can talk about. And when the FBI received it, they did absolutely nothing with it. They actually buried it for at least 10 years.
Now, why did that happen? I mean, I've got friends in the FBI. I know people in the counterterrorism groups in the FBI. They were dedicated people who really wanted to nail the bad guys that were responsible for 9/11. What went wrong, Terry?
There's absolutely wonderful people in the FBI that dedicated their lives to investigating what happened. But there were people within the FBI that did not want the truth to come out, and they have bent over backwards to protect the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It's self preservation. At that level, those people never wanted to take any responsibility for their failures. But that isn't why 9/11, it's part of why 9/11 happened, but it's because of the kingdom putting their government employees into the Saudi Arabian embassy. And it was because of their extremist beliefs that they then supported the 19 hijackers, and they created the support network that was needed here in the United States in order for them to carry out the attacks. Everything they needed, from their housing, their car rentals, their plane lessons, their airplane tickets to practice run. So for 12 to 18 months, the hijackers were here, and there was a support network that was put in place by Saudi government officials, by government people on the Saudi government payroll that are
So
responsible.
let's just quickly talk about al-Bayoumi. Omar al-Bayoumi, what was his connection to the Saudi government?
In 2017, the FBI confirmed that he was a Saudi intelligence officer. He was not just a Saudi national here on a student visa working for a company that he never showed up to, but was collecting a paycheck. And when the first arriving hijackers got here out in California, where al-Bayoumi was, his salary tripled. He was a Saudi intelligence operative.
Now, one of the things you just mentioned in the raid that was done by Scotland Yard in London, in the apartment in North London where al-Bayoumi was living at the time, there was a document found that appeared to be some kind of document planning the rate of descent necessary for an aircraft to reach a particular altitude and particular location. Can you explain to me what we know about that document?
Yes, it's called the plane drawing. And when Bayoumi was deposed, he admitted it was his handwriting. So we know it belonged to al-Bayoumi. And what it is, as you just said, it's a trajectory and it's calculations of, if you didn't have instruments, how would you land the plane? And it shows, if you put the calculations in, and experts have done this, it shows the rate of descent needed to hit a target on the ground. I think one of the calculations also, when they did the mathematical equations, showed the descent to hit the Twin Towers. So there's a drawing of an airplane, there's the mathematical calculations, and when you do the calculations as an expert, as a pilot does, I think we used a pilot that had 7 decades of experience in military and commercial aviation. And they have concluded that no doubt this was part of the 9/11 attacks.
Now, one of the things that uh, there was a Senate Select Committee for Intelligence report that was done, because I think of a lot of the good work done by yourself, raising public awareness of the fact that there were unanswered questions, that there was clearly redacted material that was
Yes.
being withheld by the US government.
Yes.
And I think from memory, there was a Florida Democratic senator called Bob Graham, who was the
Mhm.
chair, like he was the most powerful person on the Senate Intelligence
Yes.
Committee at the time. And he said in his sworn statements after their report came out that there was evidence of support from the Saudi government
Mhm.
for the terrorists. And incredibly, my understanding is there were and still are 28 redacted pages from that report that the public still haven't been allowed to see in their entirety.
In 2016, the 28 pages were released, but they, of the 20, if you were to add up all of the redactions, it adds up to about 3 pages worth of information, which was critical that they decided to withhold. But what was so
That,
astonishing?
that was my point, is that even though they've supposedly released these redacted
Yeah,
pages, that they're still redacted, and
um,
and
nothing's ever released in its entirety.
so
Nothing. Everything
they're
is
still hiding.
redacted, and
So
some
they're
things
still hiding stuff. So
are absolutely.
what
But
do
can I
you
tell you
think?
what we learned in those 28 pages? What we did learn?
Yes.
We did learn that money was going through Prince Bandar. So he was the ambassador, the Saudi Arabian ambassador to the United States. And money was going through his account as well as his wife's bank account out to California to these handlers, Bayoumi and Thumairy. And some money was being transferred, like I said, through their bank accounts out to them in California. So we knew that money was funding from the embassy. What I take away from the 28 pages is the 2 things that we learned was, one, that the Saudis are undeniably complicit in September 11th, and that the Saudis were also never fully investigated. That
Okay.
report came out before the 9/11 Commission.
Let's drill down into that because, again, there was a brief mention, I think, in the 9/11 report or in one of the later reports, that it was Prince Bandar's wife who donated money to the Al Haramain charity, which,
Hmm.
funnily enough, is the charity that was funding a lot of the madrasas I was talking about,
Yes.
the religious teaching institutions in Indonesia that I came across, which were helping fund the Wahhabist extremists in Indonesia. Now, the spin that has been put on this is that, yes, these were inadvertent fundings done by, I think, Prince Bandar's wife, that it's part of, I think they call it zakat, and please forgive me, any Muslim friends, if I've mispronounced that. But essentially, there is a duty in Islam to support those less well off than yourself. And the argument was that this was an inadvertent funding, it wasn't intentional, and that money channeled through these charities was being given for noble purposes, not specifically and intentionally for terrorism. What evidence do we have to suggest that there was knowledge at the highest levels of the Saudi government that this money was being directed to support an act of terrorism on the American public?
Bank records. Bank records show deposits and bank records show withdrawals, and they show who made these deposits and who was withdrawing the money. So the bank records support that the money was going to terrorist organizations.
But sorry, my understanding is it was the money from Prince Bandar's wife, for example, that you talked about. My understanding is it went to an Islamic charity, and that the excuse that's being used is that she's a good woman, she's got a lot of money. I think there was $36 million talked about, and that this money was being diverted just for good, noble purposes as a good Islam woman to basically support people less well off than herself. What's the evidence that Prince Bandar, his wife, or senior Saudi government officials actually knew that they were supporting a terrorist attack on America? Because that's the implication of what you're saying.
It is. It's because they were sending money out to the handlers in California that were handling the hijackers. They didn't just give money to charity, they also wrote checks and sent money directly to the handlers of the 9/11 hijackers.
So these were, I think the one of them was al-Bayoumi that you've mentioned, Omar al-Bayoumi. And who was this Fahad al-Thumairy? He was a Saudi government employee
Yeah,
working in the LA consulate, but he was
yes,
also linked to the King Fahd Mosque in
mosque.
Los
Correct,
Angeles.
correct. And that
And
is, and so, right. So Thumari was tasked by some of the employees back at Moya in Washington, D.C., to assist the hijackers when they came to the United States. And so was Bayoumi. So originally, their story was that Bayoumi just met these two hijackers in a cafe by accident. He heard them speaking Arabic, so he befriended them. But what did he do? He took them to a bank, Bank of America, and he opened up a bank account for them. They gave him $9,999 in cash to open up this bank account. And then he went and signed a lease for their apartment so that they were very close to where he lived. And then he tried to tell, uh, the police, or when he was arrested, his story was, I was just being a good Saudi Arabian citizen. It's what we do. We help people out when we meet them. But do you really go to the extent of opening up bank accounts and putting your name on a lease? And then the story just unfolds and it gets so much bigger, and the net gets so much bigger about who was actually involved in tasking Bayoumi, in tasking Thumari, and the evidence that came out of Bayoumi's apartment tells the whole story.
okay, so let's deal with this now. The 9/11 report, I'm just using the 9/11 report as a template because I think it's instructive. It's what the American people were told, the government determined in what was meant to be a transparent and open and full and rigorous inquiry into 9/11, okay?
Yes.
So this is what the 9/11 report said about what happened with these two terrorists, Hazmi and Midhar, in their first few weeks in the States. So we have investigated whether anyone associated with the King Fahd Mosque assisted them. This subject has received substantial attention in the media. Some have speculated that Fahad al-Thumairy, an imam at the mosque and an accredited diplomat at the Saudi Arabian consulate from 96 until 2003, may have played a role in helping the hijackers establish themselves on their arrival in Los Angeles. This speculation is based, at least in part, on Thumairy's reported leadership of an extremist faction at the mosque.
Correct.
Now, I know you've got an answer for this, but I'll just finish. The definitive conclusion from 9/11 was this: the circumstantial evidence makes Thumairy a logical person to consider as a possible contact for Hazmi and Midhar. Quote, yet, after exploring the available leads, we have not found evidence that Thumairy provided assistance to the two operatives. Now, I'll tell you, Terry, I'll say what I think that is. That is bullshit. That is a total lie. They knew at the time, didn't they, about Fahad al-Thumairy's funding to these two Al-Qaeda operatives, didn't they?
Well, what the 9/11 Commission knew exactly, I don't know. I can't answer. I can't speak on that. All I know is what they claimed in their final report, and what we know now is two very different things.
We're partnering with Gundry MD to share this information with you. Would you believe it if I told you that in many pantries across the United States right now, there are bottles of a substance that is one of the healthiest foods on the planet? Yep, it's true, and it's not one of those trendy superfoods that costs you a squillion. Spoiler alert, it's olive oil. But not only does it taste good, it makes you feel exceptionally healthy on the inside. And if you accept Dr. Stephen Gundry's research, it also makes you look youthful on the outside. The olive oil industry is huge, and you can tell by the number of olive oil brands you see at the grocery store, and you can bet not all of them are made with the consumer in mind. Many brands cut corners. And so Stephen Gundry has done the research. When he came to this realization about olive oil, he was appalled that some of the olive oils were frankly not that good. But some olive oils, he's discovered, are so powerful it may take only a few teaspoons or tablespoons a week to see these incredible health benefits. So how can you tell between an olive oil that can be a health booster and which one isn't up to par? In an effort to answer that question, Dr. Gundry did his research, and he's taken a stand, and he's releasing his personal research for you to review and make your own judgment on. People who have taken Dr. Gundry's advice have shared their results with him, saying the olive oil they bought after learning his simple rules has changed their lives. So make sure you go to getolive1.com/Ross or click on the link in the description box below. What is it that we know now, Terry, that's been hidden by the US government that they almost certainly knew at the time of the 9/11 Commission report? What is being concealed from the American public about this incredible period in American history? What don't we know? Please tell us.
This is the 9/11 Commission did not know about this evidence. The FBI did not hand over this evidence to the 9/11 Commission. Therefore, their findings are very different than the truth. So there was also a secret investigation into the kingdom that went on for 10 years post 9/11 called Operation Encore. And that was the FBI doing a very, very thorough job of investigating the attacks. However, that's been released. It's heavily redacted. Our representatives can see a lot more of it than we can, and we are still fighting in court to get it lifted from a protective order in the courtroom. So there's still a lot that's being hidden from us. But okay, so now what do we know? Because of the evidence that was found in Bayoumi's apartment, we know that Thumairy and Bayoumi were much closer in relations to the hijackers and they were involved with al-Qaeda operatives. They were involved with other diplomats that came from the embassy. But the al-Qaeda operatives, two of them, they're part of the advanced team that Moya sent out to California. And both of them are al-Qaeda operatives or have very close ties to al-Qaeda. And those men helped task Bayoumi and Thumairy with what needed to be done in this support network to help these hijackers. There was a welcome party where you see Thumairy and Bayoumi with the hijackers in a very casual setting. So to tell the FBI or to deny that they knew each other or that they knew them as well as they did has been proven to be wrong. And there's phone records now between everybody. And the phone records don't lie that they were actually speaking to each other and calling the embassy in Washington, D.C. during this time that the hijackers were just first in the United States and setting up the support network. So those first two advanced team, after they left California, they went to Oklahoma and Missouri. Those are the two places where Hazmi and Madar went after they left California. And the story continues that wherever that those two people went, then those two hijackers followed. So they were setting up what was needed in whatever town they were going to next. Remember, they were here for 12 to 18 months.
What's the most damning piece of evidence that you've seen where Thumairy and Bayoumi clearly went beyond just showing Islamic hospitality to these new people who'd arrived in America?
I would say the welcome party, the welcome video that clearly shows that Madar and Hazmi were guests of honor instead of the narrative that they tell is that they were sitting in a back room and they really weren't involved with the people that were there, because when the video camera scans the room is when you learn how many Saudi government officials were in the room.
And what's the evidence, though, that any of those Saudi government officials had any knowledge that these two men were terrorists, hijackers, planning an
The
attack on?
evidence, through the reporting and through the evidence, it shows which jobs they were tasked with. So different ones were tasked to help them with their flying lessons. Different ones were tasked to help them with their bank accounts. Different ones were with their buying a car, their English lessons. All of these individuals that were at this welcome party had jobs to do to help the hijackers.
So just help me here for a moment, Terry. I mean, I still wrestle with this, and I know the answer, but I want you to explain it to our audience. Why on earth would people working for the Saudi Ministry of Islamic Affairs want to launch an attack in any way, sponsor an attack on America, which, after all, is one of Saudi Arabia's biggest customers for its oil and is notionally a close friend of America? What on earth would be the motivation of these people for launching such an attack? And is it possible that these people who were working, I think, through the auspices of the Ministry of Islamic Affairs in Saudi Arabia, is it possible that they were just a bunch of hotheads who were doing this without the knowledge of the higher ups in the royal family, people like Prince Bandar?
Well, again, there was money going from Prince Bandar's bank account to assist them. And it was Prince Bandar that went to President Bush and asked him to please get them all out of the country. And he didn't want any of them to be questioned. When an Al Qaeda operative was arrested and they confiscated his phone book, he had the very private phone number of Prince Bandar's residence in Colorado that nobody had. So,
But why? Why would anybody in the Saudi government? I mean, I wrestle with this still. What was going on? Why would the Saudi government, either officially or unofficially, even if it was compromised by a few people from within, why would those people want to launch an attack on America?
because these were jihadists. These were jihadists with extremist ideology that, wanted to attack and kill Americans. And they found a way to do it, to just come under the radar into the United States, go to the Saudi embassy. Moya, the Minister of Islamic Affairs, was filled with extremists and like minded Al Qaeda operatives. And some had diplomatic credentials that were falsified so that the United States government wouldn't be watching closely what they were doing and what they were up to. So it's a branch of the Saudi government, the Ministry of Islamic Affairs, and it is government officials on the Saudi payroll that created the support network that was needed to carry out the attacks. Their motivation, Osama bin Laden, let everybody know when he issued a fatwa years before that he was going to attack the United States on US soil. It was Al Qaeda that hated the Americans that wanted to do this. And the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was filled with extremists that had Al Qaeda operatives. So Al Qaeda is a very well organized terrorist organization. And they knew the only way they could carry out the attacks is if they had a support network set up in the United States that was, like you said, going kind of under the radar. And for whatever reason, back then, Saudis were not they were not under suspicion. And even though our FBI, there was an FBI agent in Minnesota or Michigan, that called the New York FBI offices to tell them that, these Muslim nationalists or these Saudi nationalists were taking flying lessons. And they only wanted to learn how to fly, to take off. They didn't want to learn how to land. And she was very concerned about that. Well, that got ignored. The Phoenix, Arizona memo, trying to alert the FBI again that these extremists or, these people were trying to fly planes and not land them. There were so many warnings that got ignored. And yes, it was an intelligence failure. But when you ask me, why did Saudi Arabia want to attack us? It's because they were filled with radical Islamist terrorists and jihadists, and they were spreading it around the world. They were building their mosques and filling their mosques with these radical clerics, and they were radicalizing people. And it was just a very, very poisonous, venomous program. And it happened. I don't know why or how, but it did.
You've talked about the welcome video, which was the video of the party where al-Bayoumi and Fahad al-Thumairy hosted the two hijackers, the two terrorists. But there's also another video, which I personally find the most damning. And that's a video that was allegedly shot by al-Bayoumi, in 1999.
Yeah.
And can you explain what that video shows? And for me, the most chilling point in that video is where al-Bayoumi refers to the plan.
Yes. Yes. So, as part of the evidence that was seized in London, there was a casing of the U.S. Capitol that Bayoumi is in, right? So, there's somebody filming Bayoumi while he is in Washington, D.C., and he talks of the plan. And they are carefully going over the entrances, the security posts. They go inside the Capitol. He says greetings, to my esteemed brothers. And he talks about going over to the Washington Monument, and he'll get back to them when he gets over there. He talks about, he sees some workers on a scaffolding, and he goes up and he's looking at it, and he talks about the demons. He said that we, the Americans call our children the demons. He said they are the demons. It's a very eerie, shocking video to watch in its entirety. You do see and learn, and experts have confirmed. This video was filmed in the 90-day period that Al Qaeda was choosing its targets in the United States. And the Capitol was one that they were all in agreement that they wanted to use as part of their planning.
In fact, as I understand it, Flight 93 that was brought down in Pennsylvania, it's speculated that it was Flight 93 there, which was heroically brought down by passengers
Yes.
that fought the terrorists. it was intended to hit the Capitol. And I think
Yes.
on that video, I'll just talk to what the video shows. There's a moment where al-Bayoumi is filming what looks like the X-ray machines or the machines that
Yes.
scan for weapons as you go into the Capitol building. And he actually says, "You said that in the plan." That's a clear admission that there's some kind of sinister reason for why he's showing the security checkpoints at the Congress, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. And also in the video, when he does get over to the Washington Monument and he scans over to the Smithsonian, and he scans over to the Smithsonian. And if you're looking at an aerial shot between the monument and the Smithsonian, it creates a clear runway to the Capitol.
Now, the thing that really shocks me, Terry, is that video came into the possession of the American authorities within days of the 9/11 attack. They've
Yes,
had that video since they raided al-Bayoumi's apartment in 2001. So
yes.
23 years ago, they got that video, nearly a quarter of a century ago, and it's only just come out now.
Yes, and it didn't come out because the FBI ever cooperated or wanted it to come out. It came out because our representatives, the 9/11 families, went to London and asked them if we could have it. And they released it to our representatives without a protective order, which meant the public could see it. But then the courts put a protective order on it immediately. And it took months to unravel that decision. And finally, because it did not belong to the FBI and it did not belong to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, because both of those things are under protective order, the judge had to release the protective order and say this can now go out into the public domain. And yes, so then experts took it and they've translated it into English, and that's why you can see it now. It's on my website. You can see this video, and it is very disturbing and very, very upsetting, not just to see it, but like you said, to know they had it that many years ago.
So just help me here. I'm a bear with a very small brain. I want you to state the bleeding obvious, Terry. Why on earth would officials in the FBI, the American government, perhaps the White House, why would they want to suppress a video which, at the very least, reflects very poorly on the motivations and the sinister implications behind why a Saudi diplomat, a spy, was filming the Congress in that 90-day period before Osama bin Laden was selecting targets for the attacks that he was planning on America? Why would your government, why would the American government want to hide something like that?
The answers that I've been told are in the beginning when it came over to the FBI that they were understaffed and they were working so hard, worried about another attack. Because this is, 10 days to 2 weeks after the attacks. It was in Arabic. They didn't, this is what I've been told, they didn't have enough translators. And it just looked like, because it's listed as home movies, home videos, that's what Bayoumi wrote on the videos. It looked like home movies. There was a phone book in Arabic. And this is what they tell us. I'm not saying I believe it 100% at all, but that it just didn't seem that important. And it sat around for 10 years in a warehouse, I believe, and was never supposed to be seen by the
Do you
American.
believe that, Terry? I don't believe that for a moment. I think any sensible, seasoned police investigator looking at that video would reach the conclusion that at the very least, it provides circumstantial evidence of some kind of a sinister plot. Why would a Saudi intelligence official be filming the Congress's security checkpoints, security officials, even the black cars that they use for escorting politicians? And why would he be saying, you said that in the plan? It's
Yes.
more than just a tourist video, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. But remember, Bayoumi was not known as a Saudi intelligence operative post 9/11. It wasn't until 2017 that we now can see the FBI reports confirming that he is a Saudi intelligence officer. So their story is that they didn't even look at these videos because Bayoumi wasn't known as to anybody, and that they just saw home videos on them, and so everything was in Arabic. The first guy that popped it into a machine couldn't understand what it was. So this is their story, and that it just got put aside for at least 10 years.
So clearly, America buys an enormous amount of oil from Saudi Arabia. And it's quite obvious that at one stage, President Obama, when he came into power, he sought to stop and block certain things from being made public because the Saudis were actually threatening to pretty much destroy the American economy if the laws that allowed this lawsuit to be
Mhm.
taken were enabled. Um, you're up against an incredibly powerful lobby, aren't you? Let's be honest about it. The American government doesn't want
Yes.
to insult the Saudis. They may not like them. They certainly, I know for a fact, they don't like the Wahhabist extremist Islam that they were promoting through their madrasas all around the world, including in my neck of the woods in Indonesia. But they've got to get on with them. And let's be politically pragmatic for a moment. There's still a hell of a lot of redacted information that
Yes.
you and your lawyers want to get your hands on because you think there's more evidence behind the redacted documents that so far you haven't been allowed to see. What do you know about what's behind those redactions? Do you believe that those documents show even greater evidence of Saudi government complicity in the 9/11 attacks?
Yes, 100%. Otherwise, they wouldn't be so heavily redacted and they'd let us see everything. Everything we know that gets uncovered, the 28 pages, Operation Encore, what was in Bayoumi's apartment. It's always tied to the Saudis. So yeah, they're still protecting them, and it's extremely frustrating. And the families are getting older. We've lost a lot of family members, parents that have died without any justice for their families, and this is a terrible travesty of justice to allow this lawsuit to go this many years. And the Saudis have not, from what I've seen, produced any evidence. They just want to be dismissed from the case. That's why we just had another hearing on their motion to dismiss, is because that's their defense, is just dismiss us.
So I'm quoting from the lawsuit here. Basically, the lawyers representing Saudi Arabia, they challenged the lawsuit on the basis that um, they deny that Saudi officials directed support to the hijackers or were otherwise complicit. They say Thumairy did not assist the hijackers at all.
Oh,
And they said that his alleged actions would not have fallen within the scope of his official responsibilities. They say that Bayoumi's assistance was minimal and unrelated to terrorist activity, and neither he nor Thumairy belonged to a jihadist network.
oh,
Um, they say the Capitol view, the video that we're talking about, is nothing more than a typical home movie by an enthusiastic tourist,
yes.
and the San Diego video of Bayoumi's party in the hijacker's apartment is just a gathering of mosque goers for some purpose unrelated to the presence of two newly arrived Al Qaeda terrorists. So,
Yep.
what, what do you think is going to happen? Obviously, there's still arguments toing and froing in the court. Often, the best fun in a court case happens with the argy-bargy, the argument about what documents and what evidence will be allowed in. Do you think that the lawsuit is going to be allowed to proceed with the evidence that you know is hidden behind those redactions?
Oh, I certainly hope so. I don't see how the judge could not keep them in the lawsuit and allow it to continue based on what I saw on the July 31st hearing, where all of this evidence was seen for the very first time. And the kingdom tells a story, but they have no evidence that ever can back up their theories. Because with discovery, we now have the phone records, and we never had that before. The phone records don't lie. You can't, and there were other videos found in the apartment of them with the cleric Alawaki, the known underwear bomber from California. They're in a video with him. And there's videos of them with Al Qaeda operatives. There are phone records of them speaking to al-Qaeda operatives, and there's money coming, flowing in from charities through al-Qaeda. The kingdom doesn't even deny that they gave money to al-Qaeda. They're trying to deny that that the government had anything to do with the 9/11 attacks. But you sent your government officials here to the United States, and they were known jihadist sympathizers. They were extremists. You were doing that around the world. Do we think the United States was immune to that? No. They were filling the mosques with extremists, and they put them in Moya and the Ministry of Islamic Affairs. And what happened next was a horrific, plan and plot to use airplanes as missiles and to hit our landmarks and to murder Americans on American soil. That was Osama bin Laden's grand scheme, and the kingdom funded it and gave the hijackers everything they needed to carry out the attacks.
Let's go back to 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
We're in the days following 9/11. Let's do something that should have been done by the FBI and all of the intelligence services in the wake of that appalling attack on the American people. Yes, evidence starts emerging of Saudi complicity. We know that 15 of the 19 hijackers are Saudis. That's shocking in and of itself. Then you've got this ridiculous situation where Prince Bandar, the Saudi government senior official in the embassy in Washington, is pleading with the Bush government administration to get all of these Saudi family people, the House of Saud family people, out of America as quickly as possible. But there's a no-fly over the entire continental USA. The FBI is being asked to help facilitate these families. Incredibly, there were police officers who were brought in to help these people get out of the country and get to an airport where they could be put on a plane and flown back to Saudi Arabia. What if, instead of putting all of these people onto the plane, they were deposed and made to do interviews with the FBI before they got onto the plane, and including some of the members of the bin Laden family themselves, who were later implicated in paying money to the Al-Haramain charity that was actually funding some of these terror attacks? What if they'd actually taken statements from these people in 2001 before they were allowed to leave the country? And then what if they had aggressively investigated the probability that Saudi government officials were involved in these attacks? Because we now know, as you've rightly pointed out, and as your lawsuit demonstrates, we know that these two Saudi government officials were involved with these hijackers. What if the United States government, instead of tugging its forelock to the Saudi Arabian government and saying, yes, sir, no, sir, we don't want to lose your oil, what if they'd taken them on and said, this is appalling, this is outrageous, you are a friend of our country, you have attacked our country and murdered our citizens, you will get to the bottom of this now, and we do not care at all what it will take to get to the bottom of this. We will annihilate you if you don't give us the answers. What if the US had played tough with the Saudis and actually done the job of properly investigating what you're revealing now? Do you think we would have got a different result?
Yes, I do think we would definitely have gotten a different result. We would have gotten the truth instead of lies and cover up all these years.
Do you think that the lawsuit is going to be influenced by the American government? I mean, the government can plead sovereign privilege. I don't know what you call it over there, but over here in Australia, we have a thing called public interest immunity, which allows the government to basically disguise or hide anything it wants to hide that involves national security or international relations. If they don't want to upset a government and there's something stinky in a document they don't want revealed, they can hide it. Now, your government can pretty much do the same, can't it?
Yes. Yes, and they have done the same. That's why we haven't seen all of this information for nearly 2 decades. But the lawsuit with Discovery, and President Biden in 2021 issued an executive order that mandated our intelligence agencies to go back and declassify everything to the greatest extent possible. The FBI, the DOJ, the CIA, have been dragging their feet. They do not cooperate with the executive order fully. But then other things have come out, like this evidence that was found in Bayoumi's apartment. I mean, thank God we have that. And some of the heavily redacted documents, the representatives can see more than we can see. So a lot of names have been revealed over the years now. It wasn't just those two individuals. Yes, they were the ones tasking to help them directly, but they had dozens, at 27 to 30 other Saudi officials helping them out. So it's an
I,
outrageous, it's just completely outrageous that this was
it is.
kept from.
It makes me very angry. And I mean, obviously, you lost a loved one, and obviously many friends in
Yeah.
the attacks in New York. I mean, I saw what happened in Bali, and I'll never forget that. And to me, the thing that really shocked me was the tolerance that was shown by my government, by the Indonesian government, towards the Saudis who were implicated in funding this poisonous Wahhabist Islamist hateful, really hateful strand of Islam. And I don't know if you know much about Indonesia, but when I first traveled there as a very young man, it had a beautiful form of Islam called Sufi Islam, which was a very gentle and kind form of Islam. And over the last 30 or 40 years, I've watched the radicalization of young people, including intelligent middle class people, very rich people in Indonesia, who are being poisoned by this cancerous Wahhabist streak of Islam. And it led to the attacks of 9/11. And the thing that really shocks me from what you're saying is the cover up about the Saudis' involvement in doing that. Even if they've changed their tune now, it continues to this day.
Yes, it does. I don't obviously how can I possibly know the reasons other than what I could imagine is that the kingdom or the Saudi government is the lesser of the two evils in the Middle East between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And if we can continue propping up the kingdom and that trying to keep some peace in the Middle East has to do with the survival of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. But it doesn't excuse them for what they did. It doesn't excuse them for the spread of Wahhabism, this cancerous form of Islam that they financed and allowed to flourish. They unleashed the Frankenstein on the world, and innocent Americans were murdered on September 11th, and nobody should have to bear witness to the carnage left behind of a terrorist attack like you have witnessed and the rescue workers witnessed. And wherever a horrible attack happens, innocent people see things they can't unsee, and rescue workers and policemen, are part of that. They have to witness carnage. Nobody should. So I've really taken on this mission because I want justice for the 9/11 families. I want justice for the murder of my husband. But I also hope that we can deter future terrorist attacks by exposing this underbelly, the financial network that supports extremism. And yes, the kingdom was the father of Al Qaeda, and Sudan was its mother. That's where the terrorists were nurtured and trained and protected. Iran wasn't any better. So it's about rooting out the evil and trying to expose it and creating better policies going forward.
So, where are you at with the lawsuit? What's the status of the lawsuit at the moment?
Right now, we are waiting for the judge to make his determination whether he will dismiss the kingdom or keep them in the lawsuit. So they have filed a motion to be dismissed. The hearing was on July 31st. It's where a lot of this evidence came out, and the kingdom had nothing to really show. The kingdom really was very weak in their arguments. They tried to tell the judge that the plane drawings and the trajectories that show calculations to hit a target on the ground were Bayoumi's son's homework. That was their defense. Bayoumi himself, in his own deposition, did not say anything about that being his son's homework. So that is how weak their defense is, because you can't defend the indefensible. So they really have very little, and they don't have things to argue in the court. All they want is to be dismissed. Because they know they don't have a case. And we're on pins and needles here. The families, we're headed towards the anniversary. It's a very disturbing time of year for us, and the judge hasn't ruled yet. And we don't know when he will. It'll just come one day. We don't know yet.
How deep would this go for the families to see the judge throwing out the lawsuit against the Saudi Arabian government in light of what you know?
Oh boy. I don't want to live in a world where the poor families will have to go through something that traumatic, to another dismissal, because they have been dismissed in the past, but they were dismissed before this discovery was ever happened. And now that we have all of this evidence, none of us can possibly imagine that they will be dismissed. But if they are, then we have to go back to the appellate courts and we have to appeal the decision. And we have to encourage Congress to enact legislation that solidifies what the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act was meant to do, and that is to be able to apply aiding and abetting correctly. So there's even sometimes a technicality that could cause a dismissal. We're trying to just tie up all the loose ends to ensure that that never happens. But the evidence speaks for itself. They were definitely complicit in the attacks at a level nobody knew before this evidence came out.
Well, Terry Strada, I think anybody watching this, at the very least, wants to make sure that you and all the other families of the victims of 9/11 get the opportunity to have your day in court. I think most Americans would be offended by the idea of the American government cravenly participating in a cover-up to conceal evidence of Saudi government complicity, if that exists. And I
Yes.
think that the simple fact that a government might feel cowed about allowing a lawsuit to go ahead because it's worried about the damage to the economy, there's no way that morally this should be allowed to be hindered. There should be an open and public accounting for what really happened in 9/11. And I think most people in the world would be behind you.
Yes, thank you. And you're absolutely right. Congress supports our day in court, right? They support legislation and then they support our efforts. It's been our administrations, and it's been every single one of them. The Bush administration started it when they excised the 28 pages from the joint inquiry and fully redacted that. Then when President Obama came along, for 7 years, we were trying to get the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act enacted. 7 years, his entire presidency, and he vetoed it when the 9/11 families had to go back to Congress and ask them to please, do your best to override the veto. And they did. And that was the one and only veto override of his entire presidency. So he was no help to us. He never wanted us to have our day in court. And then comes along President Trump. And now we're in the courtrooms. We just need the evidence. And we go to him personally, to Washington, D.C., to the White House on the 19th anniversary of September 11th. Family members, I was one of them, and asked him to please, release this evidence. And the very next day, AG Barr stamped state secrets across everything. And it was an egregious abuse of the state secrets process, because you can only, in this country, apply state secrets if it's a threat to national security. And there was no threat to national security having any of this released. So what happens after Trump leaves office is President Biden comes in and he issues we go for the Transparency Act, the 2021 Transparency Act. I was there in front of the Capitol introducing the bill, and within months, or very short amount of time, Biden picked up the legislation and he used the language and he wrote this executive order, and he said, give them everything to the best that you can. And the FBI still held on to all of that Bayoumi evidence. So our intelligence agencies do not cooperate, and they do not help us. And the administration is who the Department of Justice answers to. So again, Congress really cares, and they do the best that they can. And that's why I need them to enact the Ensuring Justice for Victims of Terrorism Act, because that's a technical fix to the Bill JASTA. We just need to make sure that our laws are as strong as they can be to hold sponsors of terrorism attacks responsible in a courtroom. But it's been every administration. Doesn't matter if it's a Republican or a Democrat. Everyone comes in and they get told somehow, somewhere, that you're going to side with the Saudis and you're not going to help the families.
Well, Terry Strada, you are a formidable advocate for your cause. And if I was the Saudi government or the American government trying to cover this up, I'd be putting up the flag of surrender. So I think everyone wishes you the very, very best in your lawsuit. Justice is all about shining light onto things that aren't being revealed. And so we wish you all the best. And thank you so much for joining Reality Check.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for watching. Go to joinnn.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And please don't forget to click that red subscribe button to ensure you get more of NewsNation's unbiased and fact-driven news coverage.